Section 10 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in March 2011. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Section 10. Founding of the Mongol Empire by Genghis Khan, A.D. 1203, by Henry H. Howorth. Part 1. The origin and early history of the Mongols are very obscure, but from Chinese annals we learn of the existence of the race from the 6th to the 9th century in regions around the north of the Great Desert of Gobi and Lake Baikal in Eastern Asia. The name Mongol is derived from the word Mong, meaning brave or bold. Chinese accounts show that it was given to the Mongol race long before the time of Genghis Khan. It is conjectured that the Mongols were at first one tribe of a great confederacy, whose name was probably extended to the whole when the power of the imperial house which governed it gained the supremacy. The Mongol Khans are traced up to the old royal race of the Turks, who from a very early period were masters of the Mongolian desert and its borderland. Here, from time immemorial, the Mongols had made their home, leading a miserable nomadic life in the midst of a wild and barren country, unrecognized by their neighbors, and their very name unknown centuries after their kinsmen, the Turks, had been exercising an all-powerful influence over the destinies of Western Asia. But at the beginning of the 13th century arose among them a chief, Genghis Khan, the very mighty ruler, whose prowess was destined to lead the Mongolian hordes to the conquest of a vast empire, extending over China, and from India through Persia and into Russia. Who and what this mighty ruler was, and by what achievements he advanced to lay the foundations of his empire, are told by Howorth, not only with an authoritative fidelity to history, but with a literary art that is no less faithful in its appreciation of Oriental character and custom. Among the men who have influenced the history of the world, Genghis Khan holds a foremost place. Popularly, he is mentioned with Attila and with Timur as one of the scourges of God, one of those terrible conquerors whose march across the page of history is figured by the simile of a swarm of locusts or a fire in a Canadian forest. But this is doing gross injustice to Genghis Khan. Not only was he a conqueror, a general whose consummate ability made him overthrow every barrier that must intervene between the chief of a small barbarous tribe of an obscure race and the throne of Asia, and this with a rapidity and uniform success that can only be compared to the triumphant march of Alexander, but he was far more than a conqueror. Alexander, Napoleon, and Timur were all more or less his equals in the art of war. But the colossal powers they created were merely hills of sand that crumbled to pieces as soon as they were dead. With Genghis Khan matters were very different. He organized the empire which he had conquered so that it long survived and greatly thrived after he was gone. In every detail of social and political economy, he was a creator. His laws and his administrative rules are equally admirable and astounding to the student. Justice, tolerance, discipline, virtues that make up the modern ideal of a state, were taught and practiced at his court. And when we remember that he was born and educated in the desert, and that he had neither the sages of Greece nor of Rome to instruct him, that, unlike Charlemagne and Alfred, he could not draw his lessons from a past whose evening glow was still visible in the horizon, we are tempted to treat as exaggerated the history of his times, and to be skeptical of so much political insight having been born of such unpromising materials. It is not creditable to English literature that no satisfactory account of Genghis Khan exists in the language. Baron d'Ausson in French and Erdmann in German have both written minute and detailed accounts of him, but none such exists in English, although the subject has an epic grandeur about it that might well tempt some well-grounded scholar to try his hand upon it. Genghis Khan received the name of Temujin. According to the vocabulary attached to the history of the Yuan dynasty, translated from the Chinese by Hyacinth, Temujin means the best iron or steel. The name has been confounded with Temurji, which means a smith in Turkish. This accounts for the tradition related by Pakimiris, Novairi, William of Rysbrock, the Armenian Hayton, and others, that Genghis Khan was originally a smith. The Chinese historians and Sanang Setzen place his birth in 1162, Rashid and the Persians in 1155. The latter date is accommodated to the fact that they make him 72 years old at his death in 1227, but the historian of the Yuan dynasty, the Kangmu, and Sanang Setzen are all agreed that he died at the age of 66, and they are much more likely to be right. Mela says he had a piece of clotted blood in his fist when born, no bad omen, if true, of his future career. According to the Gain, Karacha Nevian was named his tutor. Sanang Setzen has a story that his father set out one day to find him a partner among the relatives of his wife, the Olkonods, and that on the way he was met by Dai Setzen, the chief of the Konkurats, who thus addressed him: "Descendant of the Kayots and of the race of the Borcheks, whither highest thou?" "I am seeking a bride for my son," was his reply. Dai Setzen then said that he recently had a dream, during which a white falcon had alighted on his hand. "This," he said, "Borchik was your token. From ancient days our daughters have been wedded to the Borchiks, and I now have a daughter named Borti who is 9 years old. I will give her to thy son." "She is too young," he said, but Temujin, who was present, urged that she would suit him by and by. The bargain was thereupon closed, and having taken a draught of komis and presented his host with 2 horses, Gisuge returned home. On his father's death, Temujin was only 13 years old, an age that seldom carries authority in the desert, where the chief is expected to command, and his mother acted as regent. This enabled several of the tribes which had submitted to the strong hand of Gisuge to reassert their independence. The Taichuts, under their leaders Terkutai, named Kiriltuk, that is, the spiteful, the great-grandson of Hemukai, and his nephew Kurul Bahadur, were the first to break away, and they were soon after joined by one of Gisuge's generals with a considerable following. To the reproaches of Temujin, the latter answered, "The deepest wells are sometimes dry, and the hardest stones sometimes split. Why should I cling to thee?" Temujin's mother, we are told, mounted her horse, and taking the royal standard called Tuk, this was mounted with the tails of the yak or mountain cow, or in default with that of a horse, it is the Tao or Tu of the Chinese, used as the imperial standard and conferred as a token of royalty upon their vassals, the Tartar princes. In her hand, she led her people in pursuit of the fugitives, and brought a good number of them back to their allegiance. After the dispersion of the Gelers, many of them became the slaves and herdsmen of the Mongol royal family. They were encamped near Sarikihar, the Saligol of Hyacinth, in the district of Ulagai Bulak, which Dosson identifies with the Ulengai, a tributary of the Ingoda that rises in the watershed between that river and the Onon. One day Taguchar, a relative of Chamuka, the chief of the Jajerats, was hunting in this neighborhood, and tried to lift the cattle of a Geler named Yusi Termeli, who thereupon shot him. This led to a long and bitter strife between Temujin, who was the patron of the Gelers, and Chamuka. He was of the same stock as Temujin, and now joined the Taichuts with his tribe, the Jajerats. He also persuaded the Yuduts and Nujakins, the Kurulas and Inkirasses, to join them. Temujin struggled in vain against this confederacy, and one day he was taken prisoner by the Taichuts. Terkutai fastened on him a keng, the instrument of torture used by the Chinese, consisting of two boards which are fastened to the shoulders, and when joined together round the neck form an effectual barrier to desertion. He one day found means to escape while the Taijuts were busy feasting. He hid in a pond with his nostrils only out of water, but was detected by a pursuer named Surgan Shire. He belonged to the Suldus clan, had pity on him, took him to his house, hid him under some wool in a cart so that his pursuers failed to find him, and then sent him to his own people. This and other stories illustrate one phase of Mongol character. We seldom hear among them of those domestic murders so frequent in Turkish history. Pretenders to the throne were reduced to servitude and generally made to perform menial offices, but seldom murdered. They illustrate another fact. Favors conferred in distress were seldom forgotten, and the chroniclers frequently explain the rise of some obscure individual by the recollection of a handsome thing done to the ruler in his unfortunate days. Another phase of Mongol character, namely the treachery and craft with which they attempt to overreach one another in war, may be illustrated by a short saga told by Sanang Setsen, and probably relating to this period of Temujin's career. It is curious how circumstantial many of these traditions are. At this time, he says, Bukhe Chilger of the Taichuts took a pitfall in his tent and covered it with felts. He then, with his brothers, arranged a grand feast, to which Temujin was invited with fulsome phrases. Formerly we knew not thine excellence, he said, and lived in strife with thee. We have now learned that thou art not false, and that thou art a Bogda of the race of the gods. Our old hatred is stifled and dead. Condescend to enter our small house. Temujin accepted the invitation, but before going he was warned by his mother. Rate not the crafty foe too lightly, she said. We do not dread a venomous viper the less because it is so small and weak. Be cautious. He replied, You are right, mother. Therefore do you, Kassar, have the bow ready. Belgute, you also be on your guard. You, Chachikin, see to the horse, and you, Utsuken, remain by my side. My 9 oarlocks you go in with me, and you, my 309 bodyguards, surround the yurt. When he arrived, he would have sat down in the middle of the treacherous carpet, but Utsuken pulled him aside and seated him on the edge of the felt. Meanwhile, a woman was meddling with the horse and cut off its left stirrup. Belgute, who noticed it, drove her out and struck her on the leg with his hand, upon which one Buri Buke struck Belgute's horse with his sword. The 9 Orloks now came round, helped their master to mount the white mare of Toktanga Taishi of the Korchins. A fight began, which ended in the defeat and submission of the enemy. Once more free, Temujin, who was now 17 years old, married Burte Jujin. He was not long in collecting a number of his men together, and soon managed to increase their number to 13,000. These he divided into 13 battalions of 1,000 men each, styled Gurans, each Guran under the command of a Gurkhan. The Gurkhans were chosen from his immediate relatives and dependents. The forces of the Taichuts numbered 30,000. With this much more powerful army, Temujin risked an encounter on the banks of the Baljuna, a tributary of the Ingoda, and gained a complete victory. Al-Bughazi says the Taijuts lost from 5,000 to 6,000 men. The battlefield was close to a wood, and we are told that Temujin, after his victory, piled faggots together and boiled many of his prisoners in 70 cauldrons, a very problematic story. Among his neighbors were the Jajerats or Juriats, the subjects of Chamuka, who, according to de Goin, fled after the battle with the Taijuts. One day, a body of the Jajerats who were hunting encountered some of Temujin's followers, and they agreed to hunt together. The former ran short of provisions, and he generously surrendered to them a large part of the game his people had captured. This was favorably compared by them with the harsh behavior of their suzerains, the Taijut princes, and two of their chiefs, named Ulugh Bahadur and Tugai Talu, with many of the tribe, went to join Temujin. They were shortly after attacked and dispersed by the Taijuts. This alarmed or disgusted several of the latter's allies, who went over to the party of Temujin. Among these were Chamuka, who contrived for a while to hide his rancor, and the chiefs of the Suldus and Bazyuts. Their example was soon followed by the defection of the Barins and the Telenkuts, a branch of the Gelers. Temujin's repute was now considerable, and de Maila tells us that wishing to secure the friendship of Podu, chief of the Kielye or Ikilyes, that is, the Kurulats, who lived on the river Ergon, that is, the Argun, and who was renowned for his skill in archery, he offered him his sister Termulun in marriage. This was gladly accepted, and the two became fast friends. As a sign of his goodwill, Podu wished to present Temujin with 15 horses out of 30 which he possessed, but the latter replied, "To speak of giving and taking is to do as merchants and traffickers, and not allies. Our elders tell us it is difficult to have one heart and one soul in two bodies. It is this difficult thing I wish to compass. I mean to extend my power over my neighbors here. I only ask that the people of Kielye shall aid me." Temujin now gave a grand feast on the banks of the Onon and distributed decorations among his brothers. To this were invited Siche Bigi, chief of the Bergins or Barins, his own mother, and two of his stepmothers. A skin of kumis, or fermented milk, was sent to each of the latter, but with this distinction. In the case of the eldest, called Kakurshin Katun, it was for herself and her family; in that of the younger, for herself alone. This aroused the envy of the former, who gave Sichir, the master of ceremonies, a considerable blow. The undignified disturbance was winked at by Temujin, but the quarrel was soon after enlarged. One of Kakushin's dependents had the temerity to strike Belgute, the half-brother of Temujin, and wounded him severely in the shoulder, but Belgute pleaded for him. "The wound has caused me no tears. It is not seemly that my quarrels should inconvenience you," he said. Upon this, Temujin sent and counseled them to live at peace with one another, but Siche Bigi soon after abandoned him with his Barins. He was apparently a son of Kakwashin Katun, and therefore a step-brother of Temujin. About 1194, Temujin heard that one of the Taijut chiefs, called Muchin Sultu, had revolted against Magadu, the Qin emperor of China, who had sent his Chinsang, prime minister, Wanzhan Xiang, with an army against him. He eagerly volunteered his services against the old enemies of his people, and was successful. He killed the chief and captured much booty. Inter alia was a silver cradle with a covering of golden tissue, such as the Mongols had never before seen. As a reward for his services, he received from the Chinese officer the title of Jaut Ikuri, written Cha-u-Tulu in hyacinth, who says it means commander against the rebels. According to Rashid, on the same occasion, Tului, the chief of the Kerites, was invested with the title of Wang, king. On his return from this expedition, desiring to renew his intercourse with the barons, he sent them a portion of the Tartar booty. The bearers of this present were maltreated. Maila, who describes the event somewhat differently, says that 10 of the messengers were killed by Siche Bigi, to revenge the indignities that had been put on his family. Temujin now marched against the barons and defeated them at Tulan Buldak. Their 2 chiefs escaped. According to Maila, they were put to death. In 1196, Temujin received a visit from Wang Khan, the Karaite chief who was then in distress. His brother, Ilkha Sengun, better known as Jagampu Karaite, had driven him from the throne. He first sought assistance from the chief of Karakitai, and when that failed him, turned to Temujin, the son of his old friend. Wang Khan was a chief of great consequence, and this appeal must have been flattering to him. He levied a contribution of cattle from his subjects to feast him with, and promised him the devotion of a son in consideration of his ancient friendship with Yisuge. Temujin was now, says Maila, one of the most powerful princes in these parts, and he determined to subjugate the Kiedye, the inhabitants of the Argun, but he was defeated. During the action, having been hit by 12 arrows, he fell from his horse unconscious, when Bogochi and Burgol, at some risk, took him out of the struggle. While the former melted the snow with some hot stones and bathed him with it so as to free his throat from the blood, the latter, during the long winter night, covered him with his own cloak from the falling snow. He would nevertheless have fared badly if his mother had not collected a band of his father's troops and come to his assistance together with Tului, the Karaite chief, who remembered the favors he had received from Temujin's father. Maila says that returning home with a few followers, he was attacked by a band of robbers. He was accompanied by a famous crossbowman named Tsu, to whom he had given the name of Mergen. While the robbers were within earshot, Mergen shouted, "There are 2 wild ducks, a male and a female. Which shall I bring down?" "The male," said Temujin. He had scarcely said so when down it came. This was too much for the robbers, who dared not measure themselves against such marksmanship. The Merkits had recently made a raid upon his territory and carried off his favorite wife, Burte Jujin. It was after her return from her captivity that she gave birth to her elder son, Juji, about whose legitimacy there seems to have been some doubt in his father's mind. It was to revenge this that he now, in 1197, marched against them and defeated them near the river Munche. A river Manzin is still to be found in the canton Karasmuren. He abandoned all the booty to Wang Khan. The latter, through the influence of Temujin, once more regained his throne, and the following year, 1198, he headed an expedition on his own account against the Merkits, and beat them at a place named Buker Gehesh, but he did not reciprocate the generosity of his ally. In 1199, the 2 friends made a joint expedition against the Naimans. This tribe was now divided between 2 brothers who had quarreled about their father's concubine. One of them, named Buyuruk, had retired with a body of the people to the Kitziltash Mountains. The other, called Baibuka, but generally referred to by his Chinese title of Taiwan or Taiyang, remained in his own proper country. It was the latter who was now attacked by the 2 allies and forced to escape to the country of Kemjut, that is, toward the sources of the Yenisei. Chamuka, the chief of the Jajarats, well named Sachan or the Crafty, still retained his hatred for Temujin. He now whispered in the ear of Wang Khan that his ally was only a fair-weather friend. Like the wild goose, he flew away in winter, while he himself, like the snowbird, was constant under all circumstances. These and other suggestions aroused the jealousy of Wang Khan, who suddenly withdrew his forces and left Temujin in the enemy's country. The latter was thereupon forced to retire also. He went to the river Sali or Sari. Guksu Serak, the Naiman general, went in pursuit, defeated Wang Khan in his own territory, and captured much booty. Wang Khan was hard-pressed and was perhaps only saved by the timely succor sent by Temujin, which drove away the Naimans. Once more did the latter abandon the captured booty to his treacherous ally. After the victory, he held a Kuriltai on the plains of Sari or Sali, to which Wang Kan was invited, and at which it was resolved to renew the war against the Taichuts in the following year. The latter were in alliance with the Merkits, whose chief Tukta had sent a contingent, commanded by his brothers, to their help. The two friends attacked them on the banks of the river Onon. Rashid says in the country of Onon, that is, the great desert of Mongolia. The Confederates were beaten. Teruktai Kiriltuk and Kuduhar, the two leaders of the Taichuts, were pursued and overtaken at Lengut Nurameng, where they were both killed. Another of their leaders with the two chiefs of the Merkits fled to Burkuchin, that is, Burgusin on Lake Baikal, where the fourth found refuge with the Naimans. This victory aroused the jealousy of certain tribes which were as yet independent of Temujin, namely the Kunkurats, Durbans, Gelers, Katakins, Saljuts, and Taijuts, and they formed a confederacy to put him down. We are told that their chiefs met at a place called Aru Bulak and sacrificed a horse, a bull, a ram, a dog, and a stag, and striking with their swords swore thus: "Heaven and earth, hear our oaths. We swear by the blood of these animals, which are the chiefs of their kind, that we wish to die like them if we break our promises." The plot was disclosed to Temujin by his father-in-law, Daisetsen, a chief of the Kunkurats. He repaired to his ally Wang Kan, and the two marched against the Confederates and defeated them near the lake Buyur. He afterward attacked some Confederate Taichuts and Merkits on the plain of Timurkin, that is, of the river Timur or Temir, and defeated them. Meanwhile, the Kunkurats, afraid of resisting any longer, marched to submit to him. His brother, Juji Kasar, not knowing their errand, unfortunately attacked them, upon which they turned aside and joined Chamuka. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in March 2021. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rosita Johnson, and John Rudd. Section 11. Founding of the Mongol Empire by Genghis Khan, A.D. 1203, by Henry H. Howorth, Part 2. That inveterate enemy of Temujin had at an assembly of the tribes, in Kirases, Kurulases, Taijuts, Katakins, and Saljuts, held in 1201, been elected Gurkhan. They met near a river called Kieho by Maila, Kian by Hyacinth, and Kem by Rashid, and then adjourned to the Tula, where they made a solemn pact, praying that whichever of them was unfaithful to the rest might be like the banks of that river which the water ate away, and like the trees of a forest when they are cut into faggots. This pact was disclosed to Temujin by one of his friends who was present, named Kuridai. He marched against them and defeated them at a place north of the Selinga called Ede Kyurgan, that is, site of the grave mounds. Chamuka fled, and the Kunkurats submitted. In the spring of 1202, Temujin set out to attack the tribes Anchi and Chagan. These were doubtless the subjects of Wangchuk and Tsagan mentioned by Sanang Setsen. They were probably Tungusian tribes. The Western writers tell us that Temujin gave orders to his soldiers to follow up the beaten enemy without caring about the booty, which should be fairly divided among them. His relatives, Kuja, Daritai, and Altun, having disobeyed, were deprived of their share, and became, in consequence, his secret enemies. Sanang Setsen has much more detail, and his narrative is interesting because, as Schmidt suggests, it apparently contains the only account extant of the conquest of the tribes of Manchuria. He says that while Temujin was hawking between the river Olcho and the Yula, Wangchuk Kakan of the Churchit, Nyuchi Tartars of Manchuria, had retired from there. Temujin was angry and went to assemble his army to attack the enemy's capital. But as a passage was forbidden him across the river Yula and the road was blockaded, the son of Toktanga Bagatur Taichi, named Andun Ching Taichi, coupled 10,000 horses together by their bridles and pressed into the river, forced the passage, and the army then began to besiege the town. Temujin sent word to Wangchuk and said, "If you will send me 10,000 swallows and 1,000 cats, I will cease attacking the town," upon which the required number was procured. Temujin fastened some lighted wool to the tail of each and let them go. Then the swallows flew to their nests in the houses, and the cats climbed and jumped on the roofs. The city was fired, by which means Temujin conquered Wangchuk Kakan, and took his daughter Salichai for his wife. He then marched farther eastward to the river Unegen, but he found it had overflowed its banks, whereupon he did not cross it, but sent envoys to Tsaken Kakan of the Solongos, that is, of the Solons. "Bring me tribute, or we must fight," he said, upon which Tsagan Kakan was frightened, sent him a daughter of Dair Usun, named Kulan Goa, with a tent decorated with panther skins, and gave him the tribes of Solongos and Bugas as a dowry, upon which he assisted Tsagan Kakan, so that he brought 3 provinces of the Solongos under his authority. Sanang Setsen at this point introduces one of those quaint sagas which, however mythical in themselves, are true enough to the peculiar mode of thought of the Mongols to make them very instructive. The saga runs thus. During a 3 years' absence of her husband, Burte Jujin sent Argasun Chochi, that is, Agasun the lute player, to him. When the latter was introduced, he spoke thus: "Thy wife, Burte Jujin Katun, thy princely children, the elders and princes of thy kingdom are all well. The eagle builds his nest in a high tree. At times he grows careless in the fancied security of his high-perched home. Then even a small bird will sometimes come and plunder it and eat the eggs and young brood. So it is with the swan whose nest is in the sedges of the lake. It, too, trusts too confidently in the dark thickets of reeds, yet prowling water falcons will sometimes come and rob it of eggs and young. This might happen to my revered lord himself." These words aroused Temujin from his confident air. "Thou hast spoken truly," he said, and hied him on his way homeward. But when some distance still from home, he began to grow timid. "Spouse of my young days, chosen for me by my noble father, how dare I face thee, home-tarrying Burte Jujin, after living with Chulan, whom I came across in my journey? It would be shameful to seem unfriendly in the assembly of the people. One of you 9 Orlogs his you to Burte Jujin and speak for me." Mukuli of the Jelair tribe volunteered, and when he came to her delivered this message: "Besides protecting my own lands, I have looked around also elsewhere. I have not followed the counsel of the greater and lesser lords. On the contrary, I have amused myself with the variegated colors of a tent hung with panther skins. Distant people to rule over, I have taken Chulan to be my wife. The Khan has sent me to tell you this." His wife seems to have understood the enigmatical phrases, for Setsen says, "The sensible Burte Jujin thus replied, 'The wish of Burte Jujin and of the whole people is that the might of our sovereign may be increased. It rests with him whom he shall befriend or bind himself to. In the reedy lakes there are many swans and geese. If it be his wish to shoot arrows at them until his fingers be weary, who shall complain? So also there are many girls and women among our people. It is for him to say who the choicest and luckiest are. I hope he will take to himself both a new wife and a new house, that he will saddle the untractable horse. Health and prosperity are not wearisome, nor are disease and pain desirable, says the proverb. May the golden girth of his house be immortal. When he arrived at home, he discovered that Argasun had appropriated his golden lute, upon which he ordered Bokochi and Mukuli to kill him. They seized him, gave him 2 skins full of strong drink, and then went to the Khan, who had not yet risen. Bokochi spake outside the tent, "The light already shines in your ordu. We await your commands, that is, if your effulgent presence, having cheerfully awoke, has risen from its couch. The daylight already shines. Condescend to open the door to hear and to judge the repentant culprit, and to exercise your favor and clemency." The Khan now arose and permitted Argasun to enter, but he did not speak to him. Bogochi and Mukuli gave him a signal with their lips. The culprit then began. While the 70-tuned Tsaktsanggai unconcernedly sings Tang Tang, the hawk hovers over and pounces suddenly upon him and strangles him before he can bring out his last note, Jang. So did my lord's wrath fall on me and has unnerved me. For 20 years have I been in your household, but have not yet been guilty of dishonest trickery. It is true I love smoked drink, but dishonesty I have not in my thought. For 20 years I have been in your household, but I have not practiced knavery. I love strong drink, but I am no trickster. Upon which Temujin ejaculated, "My loquacious Agasun, my chattering Churchi," and pardoned him. Temujin now seems to have been master of the country generally known as Eastern Dauria, watered by the Onon, the Ingoda, the Argun, and also of the tribes of the Tangassic race that lived on the Noni and the Upper Amur. The various victims of his prowess began to gather together for another effort. Among these were Tukta, the chief of the Merkits, with the Nayman leader Buyuruk Khan, the tribes Durban, Katagun, Saljut, and Uirat, the last of whom were clients of the Naymans. Wang Khan was then in alliance with him. At the approach of the enemy they retired into the mountains Karaun Chidun, in the Khingan chain on the frontiers of China, where they were pursued. The pursuers were terribly harassed by the ice and snow, which Maila said was produced by one of their own shamans or necromancers, and which proved more hurtful to them than to the Mongols. Many of them perished, and when they issued from the defiles, they were too weak to attack the 2 allies. The latter spent the winter at Alcha Kungur. Here their 2 families were united by mutual betrothals. As these, however, broke down, ill feeling was aroused between them, and Chamuka had an opportunity of renewing his intrigues. He suggested that Temujin had secret communications with the Naymans and was not long in arousing the jealousy of Wang Khan and his son Sengun. They attempted to assassinate him, but he was warned in time. He now collected an army and marched against the Kerites. His army was very inferior in numbers, but attacked the enemy with ardor. Wang Khan's bravest tribe, the Jirkirs, turned their backs, while the Tunekkites were defeated, but numbers nevertheless prevailed, and Temujin was forced to fly. This battle, which is renowned in Mongol history, was fought at a place called Kalanchin Alt. Rashid says this place is near the country of the Niuchis, not far from the river Olkui. Some of the Chinese authorities call it Kagalun Ola and Hala Chon, and Doson surmises that it is that part of the Khingan chain from which flow the southern affluents of the Khalkha, one of which is called Halgon in Danville's map. Maila, however, distinctly places it between the Tula and the Onon, which is probably right. Abandoned by most of his troops, he fled to the desert Baljuna, where he was reduced to great straits. Here are still found many grave mounds, and the Buryats relate that this retired place, protected on the north by woods and mountains, was formerly an asylum. A few firm friends accompanied him. They were afterward known as Baljunas, a name compared by von Hammer with that of Mohachirs, borne by the companions of Mahomet's early misfortunes. 2 shepherds named Kishlik and Badai, who had informed him of Wang Chan's march, were created Turkans. Having been a fugitive for some time, Temujin at length moved to the southeast, to the borders of Lake Kara, into which flows the river Uldra. There he was joined by some Kunkurats, and he once more moved on to the sacred Mongol lake, the Dalai Nur. Thence he indited the following pathetic letter to Wang Khan. 1. O Khan, my father, when your uncle, the Gur Khan, drove you for having usurped the throne of Buyuruk and for having killed your brothers Tatimur Taichi and Buka Timur to take refuge at Keraun Kipchak, where you were beleaguered, did not my father come to your rescue, drive out and force the Gur Khan to take refuge in Ho Si, the country west of Huang Ho, whence he returned not? Did you not then become Anda, that is, sworn friend with my father, and was not this the reason I styled you father? 2. When you were driven away by the Naimans and your brother Ilka Sengun had retired to the far east, did I not send for him back again, and when he was attacked by the Merkits, did I not attack and defeat them? Here is a second reason for your gratitude. 3. When in your distress you came to me with your body peering through your tatters, like the sun through the clouds, and worn out with hunger, you moved languidly like an expiring flame. Did I not attack the tribes who molested you, present you with abundance of sheep and horses? You came to me haggard. In a fortnight you were stout and well favored again. Here is the third service we have done you. 4. When you defeated the Merkits so severely at Bukergere, you gave me none of the booty. Yet shortly after, when you were hard pressed by the Naimans, I sent 4 of my best generals to your assistance, who restored you the plunder that had been taken from you. Here is the 4th good office. 5. I pounced like a gerfalcon onto the mountain Jurkumen, and thence over the lake Buyur, and I captured for you the cranes with blue claws and grey plumage, that is to say the Durbans and Taichuts. Then I passed the lake Keule. There I took the cranes with blue feet, that is the Katakins, Saljuts, and Kunkurats. This is the 5th service I have done you. 6. Do you not remember, O Khan, my father, how on the river Kara near the Mount Jurkan we swore that if a snake glided between us and envenomed our words, we would not listen to it until we had received some explanation? Yet you suddenly left me without asking me to explain. 7. O Khan, my father, why suspect me of ambition? I have not said my part is too small, I want a greater, or it is a bad one, I want a better. When one wheel of a cart breaks and the ox tries to drag it, it only hurts its neck. If we then detach the ox and leave the vehicle, the thieves come and take the load. If we do not unyoke it, the ox will die of hunger. Am I not one wheel of thy chariot? With this letter Temujin sent a request that the black gelding of Mukuli Bahadur, with its embroidered and plated saddle and bridle, which had been lost on the day of their struggle, might be restored to him. He also asked that messengers might be sent to treat for a peace between them. Another letter was sent to his uncle Kuchir and to his cousin Altun. This letter is interesting because it perhaps preserves for us some details of what took place at the accession of Genghis. It is well known that the Mongol Khan affected a coy resistance when asked to become chief. The letter runs thus. You conspired to kill me, yet from the beginning did I tell the sons of Bartam Bahadur, that is, his grandfather, as well as Sacha, his cousin, and Taiju, his uncle. Why does our territory to the Onon remain without a master? I tried to persuade you to rule over our tribes. You refused. I was troubled. I said to you, Kuchir, son of the Tekun Taishi, be our Khan. You did not listen to me. And to you, Altun, I said, You are the son of Kutluk Khan, who was our ruler. You be our Khan. You also refused, and when you pressed it on me, saying, Be you our chief, I submitted to your request, and promised to preserve the heritage and customs of our fathers. Did I intrigue for power? I was elected unanimously to prevent the country, ruled over by our fathers near the 3 rivers, passing to strangers. As chief of a numerous people, I thought it proper to make presents to those attached to me. I captured many herds, yurts, women, and children, which I gave you. I enclosed for you the game of the steppe, and drove toward you the mountain game. You now serve Wang Khan, but you ought to know that he is fickle. You see how he has treated me. He will treat you even worse. Wang Khan was disposed to treat, but his son Sengun said matters had gone too far, and they must fight it out. We now find Wang Khan quarreling with several of his dependents, whom he accused of conspiring against him. Temujin's intrigues were probably at the bottom of the matter. The result was that Dariti Uchegin, with a tribe of Mongols, and the Sakyat tribe of the Kerites went over to Temujin, while Altun and Kuchir, the latter's relations, who had deserted him, took refuge with the Naimans. Among the companions of his recent distress, a constant one was his brother Juji Kasar, who had also suffered severely and had had his camp pillaged by the Kerites. Temujin had recourse to a ruse. He sent 2 servants who feigned to have come from Juji and who offered his submission on condition that his wife and children were returned to him. Wang Khan readily assented, and to prove his sincerity sent back to Juji Karsar some of his blood in a horn, which was to be mixed with kumis and drunk when the oath of friendship was sworn. Wang Khan was completely put off his guard, and Temujin was thus able to surprise him. His forces numbered about 4,600, and he seems to have advanced along the banks of the Kerulon towards the heights of Jetchir, between the Tula and the Kerulon, and therefore toward the modern Urga, where Wang Khan was posted. In the battle which followed, and which was fought in the spring of 1203, the latter was defeated. He fled to the Naimans and was there murdered. Temujin was sincerely affected by the death of the old man. The Naiman chief, Taiyang, had his skull encased in silver and bejeweled, and afterward used it as a ceremonial cup, a custom very frequent in Mongolia. Such cups have been lately met with in Europe, one of which was exhibited at the Great Exhibition of 1851, where it was shown as the skull of Confucius. Another, or perhaps the same, which was encased in marvelous jewelers' work, has been lately destroyed, the gold having been barbarously melted by the Jews. By the death of Wang Khan, Temujin became the master of the Kerite nation, and thus both branches of the Mongol race were united under one head. He now held a Kuriltai, where he was proclaimed Khan. There is some confusion about the period when he adopted the title of Genghis, but the probability is that he did so 3 years later. The earlier date, 1203, is the one, however, from which his reign is often reckoned to have commenced. End of section 11.